for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dawn Willoughby. I am the Marketing Manager for Anishinaabe Development Fund. And today we have Etienne Esquega and Molly MacDonald, and they're from Esquega Law Office, and we'll be presenting on COVID-19 and what employers and employees need to know about returning to work. The questions, they'll be taking questions, and you can put those into the chat box on the side here, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So Etienne and Molly, can you quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Etienne Esquega. I've been practicing in Northwestern Ontario since my call to the bar in 2005. 2012, I went out on my own and set up my own office, known as the Esquega Law Office. And shortly after that, Molly joined me in the past couple of years, and we do a lot of work with Indigenous communities, businesses, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this issue in particular. Now that the economy is hopefully going to be opening up and people will be getting back to work on a gradual basis. Molly?
Hi everyone, my name is Molly MacDonald. As Etienne mentioned, I joined Esquega Law Office about 3 years ago. I've been practicing since 2017, and I'm from Thunder Bay. And yeah, as Etienne noted, we've been thinking a lot about these types of issues, especially in the last couple months. So looking forward to the presentation and everyone's questions.
Okay, perfect. So we can get started here. Just for any questions that you come up with during your presentation, please put them into the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And I shall see you all later.
Okay, so I guess I'll start off the presentation. We allocated about 45 minutes for this presentation. I'd like to acknowledge all the hard work that Molly has put into this presentation. She's been working on this for the past couple of days, and I've come in towards the end to help find minutes for today. So thank you, Molly. Great job. As I mentioned, we've been talking about this a lot, and I've also been talking to many people in the industry about what they're doing, and it's a very scary time because we don't know if we're safe to go back to work or not. So it's important that you probably just take it easy, and that's what I'm hearing from industry. For example, there's another advisory service provider in town, and some of the things that they've done to minimize exposure or risk of exposure within the workplace is to implement a system of shifts, where a certain group will come in the morning to work and another group will come later on. You never have people coming in and out at the same time. And they also give their employees the opportunity to work from home because they can do that. So that's one example of another advisory service in town in terms of what they're doing. In terms of me and Molly, we haven't been in the same place at the same time together since March. I think it was 14th or something like that. March 12th was the last time I went to my office where Molly was there. Shortly after that, she had a meeting 2 days later, and I panicked because at that point the pandemic was already starting, and I participated in that. It was kind of a really weird time because the pandemic was being declared, but at the same time people were still meeting, and she hosted me at our office. I was like, what do you do? We can't host no more meetings. So the last thing we had at our office was on Friday. So basically, we've not been in the same, we've not worked in the same place since middle of March, and we're looking at this from a succession planning point of view. In the event that I were to get sick, the plan is Molly is here and she can handle the files and run the show while I deal with the virus, and vice versa. And that's always been a major concern for us, is that we have a number of clients that we service on a regular basis, and we have to ensure that someone's available because we're a small operation. So getting into the presentation itself, we'll talk about more of these things as we go on. But the general overview of the presentation is we're going to look at legal obligation employers. We're going to touch on that briefly here. And then we're going to get into more specifics about, return to work planning, and workplace policies. We're going to get into the issue of employees' rights to refuse unsafe work, what employees' rights and procedural steps are available, the duty to accommodate, and protection from reprisals. We're also going to talk about the recent benefits that it provides from the federal government to employees and employers, and what your responsibilities may be in regards to those. And then we've talked about preparing for different thoughts into preparing for multiple waves. I know everyone's been focused on a second wave, but my view, I think we should be prepared for multiple waves, because I don't know when we're going to be safe, and might as well plan for something worse down the road, unfortunately.
Right, excuse me, Molly, can you put your mic while I'm speaking, and vice versa? Getting some feedback?
Of course.
Okay, go ahead, Etienne. Sorry about that.
Okay. I have another observer here. So I have to tell her to leave while I do this. Apologize. So legal obligations provide a safe workplace on all employers, and really your number one priority will be making sure that the employees and the public are safe. However, we look at this issue from a negligence perspective as well, in terms of you may be exposing yourself to negligence if you don't turn your mind to ensuring that there's a safe place for workers and the public during the pandemic. So you're going to need to do your due diligence and have good policies in place to protect your employees and minimize your risk. Before I move on to the next slide, I think I was thinking about this generally earlier, and one of the things that we often see or like to see when we're looking at a file, when we're involved in defending or prosecuting or trying to advance a negligence claim, is paperwork. And you should always keep that in mind. Have good documents in place, or document preparations, policies in place to document the steps that you're going to take as you go down this road. You want to keep minutes of important meetings to prove that you've turned your mind to these important issues. And when employees are dealing with employers, or when employers are dealing with employees, it's important to confirm things in writing to the extent that you can, just so that there's a paper record or electronic paper record of what's taken place. So the legal obligations to provide a safe workplace come from a number of different pieces of legislation. We're looking at this very high level right now. We're looking at this from, there's provincial, and there's also federal. So provincially, you have the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And if you visit our website, we've done some commentary on the Occupational Health and Safety Act in the context of medical workers, for example, when the pandemic first started, because there's a lot of concern about PPE not being available and so forth. But generally, the same rules apply. There's an obligation on all employers. It's a strict duty to provide information, instruction, and supervision to a worker to protect their health and safety. You have to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. And you have to prepare your policies, which should be reviewed at least annually. If you're in a federal workplace, well, then you also have the Canada Labor Code that deals with this issue. And Section 25 and Section 124 talk about the obligations to ensure that the workplace is safe as well, and also dealing with policies and procedures. So in addition to any negligence possible claims that may arise from you not doing your duty, there's also, there's offenses under both of these pieces of legislation, which could result in a conviction or jail time for both of them. So the first one is the Canada Labor Code. Section 148 talks about what happens if you contravene the provisions of the Act, and you can be convicted of indictment of a fine of not more than $1 million, or prison, or you can end up in prison for up to 2 years, or both. And on some summary conviction, the fine could be up to $100,000. Again, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's offenses and possible convictions that can happen under that act as well, and you can end up again in jail for a period of up to 12 months, or you can be in prison. Or sorry, you can have a fine up to $100,000. But if you're a corporation, the offense can be up to $1.5 million. And there is a defense under the acts, and that requires you generally to show that you've taken the steps reasonable in the circumstances to deal with the situation. So if you don't plan for the pandemic return to work, you likely not be able to meet that test. So in your reopening considerations, you have to consider a reopening plan. The legislation talks about the policies, so you should be thinking about pandemic policies, and you should also be thinking long-term into implementation, training, and resources to open up. Now this is where Molly and I, we talk a lot about reopening plans and what's reasonable. We do a lot of work with Indigenous communities, and we're often talking about, you know, how can this occur? Right now, it's probably best that if it's an office type job and you can accommodate your employees, the best bet or the best plan right now would probably be to ensure that your employees are just like me and Molly and not working under the same roof and working remotely as much as possible if you can facilitate that. So you need to look at your restrictions, whether or not there's any restrictions imposed on you by any order. Right now, Ontario's been issuing emergency orders, and we've seen some First Nations who have adopted those orders because there's often a dispute as to whether or not they apply on reserve or not. And some First Nations have come out and been very clear in saying that we're adopting these orders because we think they're best practices and we're going to follow them. So that's important to be mindful of those orders, and they're constantly changing, and they're changing by region now, which is something you need to stay on top of. Then it's also important to have key people in place. For example, who's going to be responsible for monitoring the new and changing orders, laws, programs. Molly's going to get into a little bit more detail about some legislation that's popped up recently, and we're probably going to see more of this as this pandemic goes on, unfortunately. So it's a lot of moving parts, and staying on top of that is important. Who's going to be responsible for overseeing your implementation of those policies in-house? The legislation often talks about having health and safety committees. In these circumstances, you may want to consider whether you should have a specific pandemic safety committee, for example, that's responsible for overseeing all the policies and dealing with any issues and complaints that may arise in the workplace. And then you have to think about who you're going to consult. You know, best practice would be if you're not in a position and you feel you're not the best person to be developing policies or you're not competent to do so, then you should probably be reaching out. And you have to think about that now, like who you going to be reaching out to. You know, for example, public health officials would be important, or those who are trained in public health, because they know what the best strategies and practices are. You may need to consult specialized HR people. You're going to need to have your health and safety committees going. Union, is the union involved? Is there a collective agreement that comes into play here? And back to my earlier comments about, you know, who's all needed in the workplace. Do you need everyone there? And then you also have to look at the workplace itself and whether or not there's any modifications that need to be made to ensure that you minimize the exposure to your employees. For example, I was just talking with Molly before and discussing this issue, and most communities that have road access to Thunder Bay have in our area around here, there's they have the med van. And one of the things that came to my mind is, some simple things that could be done there is you have the med van with some plexiglass separating the driver and from the passengers in the back, and you have policies in place to say that no one else sits in the front, and you have policies talking about how that med van is going to be clean after each trip or after each person leaves the med van, for example. But that's a physical modification example that came to mind when we were discussing this earlier. And you're going to see, or you've probably heard of a number of different workplace modifications in terms of office settings and so forth.
Okay, well, that's good to know that if I lose connection, they don't.
Oh, someone's talking there. The next thing, sorry, in terms of physical modifications, we were just on the call yesterday with the courts, with the judges from the Northwest region, and there's only been one courtroom, open in this region starting in July. And that courtroom is going to be very busy because there's going to be a high demand for it, and they're going to have to triage and decide what cases go there. But the judges were talking about how things are going to change in terms of going to court. There's going to be a plexiglass separating witnesses and counsel at the table. Lawyers are going to have to wash down their area before and after they come and go. Again, another example of physical modifications after doing an inventory of the courthouse and deciding on a best practice. Pandemic policies, there's a number of different things that we'll have to go into those. Again, dealing, like I just gave the example of, the policies of having to wipe down the area after you come and go. Those are the types of things that will have to be thought about. Some other policy recommendations that you'll have to think about is encouraging employees to work from home where possible. If you're like me, you like to go to your office because it's your kind of your place away from home where you can sit down and get work done. You don't have your little 6-year-old coming in to tell you something which is not a priority, but to her it is. For example, and she just popped up in the screen here a little while ago. But but if your employees don't need to be there, then maybe you're gonna have to implement strict policy to say that, well, sorry, we can't have a whole bunch of people coming and going right now. We need to ensure that only one person comes and goes. And in our circumstances with Molly, like we discussed this early on, right from the outset, I said, Molly, you can't come to the office no more because I have to run the books and all that stuff. I need to be able to come and go from the office. So basically our rule is only I come and go to the office. If Molly needs to go in there, then we'll make arrangements for a time for her to go in there, and I won't go in there for a period of time after she goes, just in case she's a carrier of the virus, and vice versa, and she'll know when I've been in there. But we're pretty much 100% electronic, which is great. We're prepared for this, but that's another thing that you have to look at when you're developing these policies, is ensuring that people are scanning things, important things, that they're keeping notes on their paper pad, for example. Maybe a policy, especially if you work in teams, you have to scan all your notes or keep your notes by electronically using Word and saving up to the servers. There's also the policies concerning screening of employees, and this is where you want to get some advice on from public health professionals and legal people, because you don't want to be breaching someone's rights, but also you want to make sure you're making your workplace safe for everyone. Again, physical distancing, we've been hearing about that a lot. We've all been practicing it. Hand washing, sanitizing, those are all things that go into those policies. Sneezing, cough, fatigue, those are all things you're going to want to consider. I talked about this a little bit earlier about sector and workplace specific. I gave you the example of vehicles, for example, and some of the work that you can do there to ensure that, for example, the med van is safe for those who are there. Certain areas that are open to the public. If you go to some stores in town, for example, you have the hardware stores. I went into one of those not too long ago, and basically it's a smaller shop, but they didn't let you walk around the store. You had to walk in and basically ask what you wanted to get, and they would bring it to you. So they've really limited the ability for people to walk around the workplace. And that's something you may have to consider for your workplace. Hours of work, whether or not you could stagger them, we talked about that earlier. Which positions are at the highest risk? What will those people need? And we have, we did the paper earlier when the pandemic started on healthcare workers, and they're essential service workers, but they need PPE to be able to provide their services. And if you're running a nursing homes or anything like that in your communities, those are really high risk areas. You have to spend a lot of time and attention deciding how you're going to manage that workplace. Are there any industry specific guidelines that may be applicable? Doctors and dentists and police officers and correctional services workers, they may all have special specific industry guidelines that need to be consulted on to ensure you have a policy that's in compliance with those guidelines. Another good policy to consider that for every workplace would be to encourage employees to come forward and disclose if they have any symptoms, so you can deal with the situation right away. Since you have a duty to provide a safe workplace, you want to know when someone has any sort of symptom right away. And I gave you an example of within the courthouse just the other day, someone had symptoms, and immediately the courthouse addressed that, and they encouraged the person to go get tested. They took the steps internally to ensure that the exposure was minimized, even though they didn't know whether or not the person had it or not. And they consulted all the stakeholders, including all the lawyers, and we all got an email from the courthouse saying, here's what's happening. They didn't disclose details about who it was or any of that. It wasn't at that stage where they had to do contact tracing. However, they let everyone know, because who knows what lawyer would have been in and out of the courthouse. And they've also, followed up after a person tested negative. They did a follow-up to policy, probably not. However, I think that it all depends on the industry. And I know, for example, with healthcare workers, for example, or nursing home workers, they would likely be required to be tested if there's any concern about them before they come into the workplace. And this is something you need to deal with carefully, because there is a general right to not be subject to any unnecessary testing, and a lot of it may have to deal with how the virus spreads in this region. Hopefully stops spreading, and it's not a concern if people aren't if there's no more cases popping up, then maybe there's a little bit of comfort there that we don't have to worry about this. But if it's spiking but yet you have an essential workplace that you need to have people showing up to, maybe you're going to have to implement a testing regime where people get tested, because now testing apparently is available quickly in our region. But if your employees have no ability to get tested, then it's going to be very hard to impose that condition on them. So, again, this is just a very difficult question to deal with, and it's going to be case by case specific. So what happens if an employee is diagnosed with COVID-19? Well, the first thing you need to know is whether or not there's been exposure to the rest of your staff. And I gave you the example of the courthouse and how quickly they responded to the situation, and they immediately told, I'm sure they told the staff internally right away that there's potential for exposure, and they contacted out to the people who may have been in that facility for work. And at this point, it's probably the best practice to ensure that you're consulting and dealing with the public health officials for guidance. I've never had to deal with these people yet. Hopefully, I don't have to in my work, because it'd be none of my clients have had an exposure or had an issue like this. However, public health officials would be the best people to contact immediately and work with them to ensure that contact tracing gets underway and follow their advice in terms of dealing with the workplace. I gave you the example of the succession plan earlier. You're gonna have to deal with this now. Think about it. What happens if one of your key people gets the virus and you need to keep the workplace going, or that person is key to keeping the workplace going? You have to have someone else in place, you have to think about rights under the Human Rights Code in terms of, if someone's disabled, you can't discriminate against them based off their disability, and you have a duty to accommodate them to the extent of the undue hardship. And I mentioned this earlier, you also have to consider about their privacy interests as well. So you just can't just run around and say so-and-so has the virus or may have the virus. So it's a really delicate situation that you have to balance. And that's why bringing public health officials on board right away is important, because they will help you with that contact tracing and take over on that issue. So there's a slide there with a number of different resources that you can consider looking at. I'm not going to speak anymore after this. Molly's going to take over the presentation, but that's my part. Thanks, Molly.
Hi, everyone. I'll just take the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on these resources. Particularly the Thunder Bay District Health Unit has really excellent ones that are sector specific. If you're looking for something for a particular type of workplace, for office setting or childcare, retail, and they also, through links on there, there's access to different signage, like template signage, if you want to print that and post it in the workplace. So go to their website. They have really great resources if you're looking for a starting place on what you should be thinking about for your specific workplace. As Etienne mentioned, I'm going to get a little bit more into some of the statutory changes that have taken place, and these are sort of hard to keep on top of. There's been so many changes recently. It's probably fair to assume that there's going to be more as things develop, so it's important to have someone try to keep on top of it as much as possible. So one of the things that has changed recently, and you're probably at least somewhat aware of it, is there's new emergency leaves available both under the Employment Standards Act and under the Canada Labour Code, which I'll discuss after. But these are unpaid leaves. So if you're employees, or if you are an employee, if you're sick, or if you have to stay home, if you're ordered to be quarantined by a public health official, if you're subject to travel restrictions and you can't reasonably be expected to travel, if you have been out of the country and you're ordered to quarantine. Also, if there isn't childcare available and you have to look after your kids because they're not in school and their daycare isn't open, there's unpaid leave available now for that. So if you have more questions about that, there's lots of resources and places you can look for more information specific to your situation. But these are new leaves for both provincially and federally regulated employees. Under the Canada Labour Code, right now it's 16 weeks of unpaid leave. You have to provide your employer with written notice of the leave and the length that you're intended to take. Right now, it's until October 1st, but I think we all I think it's fair to say things are changing. Who knows where things will look in a couple months. So just keep on top of that and see how things progress. Medical notes are something that have been fairly common, a common requirement in the workplace up until recently. But for the leaves, under these new leaves, both in the Employment Standards Act and the Canada Labour Code, there is not a requirement to provide a medical note if you are on leave because of COVID-19, because you're waiting for your test results or you're sick, etc. And the goal here is to not unnecessarily expose people by going to the hospital or going to the doctor to get a sick note, and also not to overburden the healthcare system, which is already very busy right now writing notes for people. However, there is the ability and the requirement in certain circumstances to provide evidence reasonable in the circumstances to justify the type of leave that you need, and to just explain the reason for the leave that you're taking. So what that looks like right now it's difficult to say. We don't really know what that looks like. It'll probably be on a case-by-case basis, and hopefully both employees and employers can be reasonable here and provide good reasons for why they need to take leave, and not to be ask too much of your employees when they are when they have to be off during the pandemic for legitimate reasons, to be providing you with documentary evidence of that. But if that's an issue, and if it becomes an issue, it's something you may want to talk to your a legal counsel about, if it becomes that serious. From an employee's perspective, this has been a topic that's been coming up in the news, and earlier in the pandemic, this was a situation that was quite public with nurses especially. The right to refuse unsafe work, and this is something that is very sector specific. So depending on the type of workplace, where you work, what your job is, the rules may be a bit different. But in general, under both the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Canada Labour Code, there is a right to refuse unsafe work. So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that's found in Part 5. And then this is the legislation here. And under the Canada Labour Code, it's under Section 128. So if you're an employee and you feel that the workplace policies or procedures at your workplace are not sufficient to protect you, you have a right to refuse unsafe work, and you have to report that to the employer. And at that point, while the processes are slightly different under both acts, essentially what happens is it triggers a workplace investigation into the allegation, and to see if the work is unsafe, or what can be done about it if it is. And if at that point the issue isn't remedied right away and the employee isn't satisfied, there's opportunities to advance it further and further. Ultimately, there will be the opportunity for either the Ministry of Labor or under the federal legislation, an inspector to come and assess the workplace. At that point, what you have to consider is, if you're an employee and the workplace is found to be safe, generally you will be required to go back to work. And if you don't go back to work, that could constitute a resignation. And if that happens, it's essentially quitting your job, and you might not be eligible for CERB. So if your workplace is deemed safe, you'll generally have to go back to work. The one consideration I would urge here is that if you have a pre-existing health condition, or if you're immunocompromised, that's a little bit different, because, as noted earlier, there is a duty to accommodate disability in the workplace. So if there's a particular danger to you because of your health circumstances, that's something that is going to have to be considered a little bit differently here. So we touch on that a little bit here. But generally, the objective is that the good practices and policies put in place by your workplace and by your employer will make it safe for everyone to come back. And hopefully, if there are issues that your employees point out, or that you point out to your employer, those can be resolved in a way where everyone feels safe and everyone can go back to work. In the event that you are, as an employee, either exercising your rights under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Employment Standards Act, or the Canada Labour Code, if you're asking your employer to follow their occupational health and safety legislation, or if you yourself are doing it as an employee, you're protected from reprisals from your employer. And that means that your employer, they can't terminate you or demote you, intimidate you, or punish you in any way for exercising your rights and asking your employer to follow occupational health and safety legislation. So you have those protections there. You don't have to worry if you're asking your employer to be safe. Now, this is a bit of a transition in topic, but something that's I'm sure everyone's heard of is the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So this is a federal program. It began on March 15th, 2020. It's recently been extended for another 16 weeks. So this is the CERB, the $2,000 or $500 a week. It's essentially a part of the EI program. So you'll qualify if you've lost your, generally, if you've lost your employment because of the pandemic. You're not going to qualify for CERB if you quit your job. So that's something that, again, you should be considered if you're not going back to work and you've essentially been deemed to have resigned. And one thing for employees to note is this is taxable income, and there aren't deductions, source deductions made. So keep that in mind, that depending on how much tax you think you're going to have to pay or how much income you've made in the year, you may have to pay taxes on this, and you may want to squirrel a little bit of that away until tax time. The other consideration is that CERB will have to be repaid if you don't meet the eligibility requirements for the forward period in question. So if your employer brings you back to work and they're receiving the wage subsidy, which I'll talk about in a minute, during the same time, you may have to pay back your CERB. So you just want to be really careful when you're going back to work that there's no overlap. Maybe look into it before you go back, because you don't want to be in a position where you have to unexpectedly pay money back to CRA. So the other part of the program the federal government has put in place is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which probably many of you have also heard of. So as of Monday, look, there's been over 515,000 applications that have been approved for this, and over $15 billion in subsidies have been paid out. So if you're an employer and you haven't applied, or if you have questions about the criteria, there's many resources online. It's actually pretty user-friendly, I believe, to look into this and see if you're eligible and what you need to do. 75% of an employee's salary is eligible for subsidy up to the first $50,000. So that works out to $847 a week. There's no limit on how many employees per workplace you can apply for as well. So it doesn't matter if you're small or big workplace, you can apply for that. There is, while it's not in statute, there is the understanding that as an employer, you should be topping up your employees. It's strongly encouraged. It's not mandatory, but that's clearly the intent, to pay them the extra 25%. So we would encourage you that if you are accessing this funding, see if you can afford to top them up. If you can't, that's something that you should document, record your efforts to do so, show your math basically, because you don't know when you might need it. Think strategically about which employees to bring back, because again, this is sort of uncharted territory. We don't know really what's going to happen and how the courts are going to treat this, but you don't want to expose yourself to a potential constructive dismissal claim if you have access to the wage subsidy to bring employees back and you don't do it. This is going to be a greater concern, I believe, for employees who normally would be making a lot more money than what they're getting with CERB. So think about which employees you might want to bring back through the program if you can't afford to bring them all back, if you don't need them all back right now. Another important statutory change is extensions to the layoff periods. So both under the Canada Labour Code and the Employment Standards Act, and this is sort of general and subject to any collective agreement, and it might depend on specific employment contracts. But after a certain period, usually between 3 to 6 months, depending on the circumstances, a layoff will become a termination that will trigger paying of severance pay. So you can't just lay off your employees indefinitely. However, these transition periods for when it turns into a termination have been pushed back under both pieces of legislation. And at that point, people are going to be deemed to be on leave. So that's also something to consider here. When people are being laid off, and if you're an employee, what your options are. I think the intent here is that most employers don't want to lay off their employees. It's not intended to be indefinite, but no one really knows what's happening here or how long, and people will want to bring their employees back as soon as they can. So under the ESA, the reduction in hours and wages may not necessarily be a layoff, and then the layoff will not necessarily be constructive dismissal. So these, we'll send out the slides afterwards if you want to take a closer look at the actual provisions. Finally, something that everyone should consider, and Etienne and I have talked about it as well, is preparing for future waves. We were really fortunate in our office that we were able to fairly seamlessly transition into working from home because we had everything in place to do so. Like almost 6 months in advance, we sort of transitioned to a fully, for the most part, wireless operation where we could both work from home. We had great teleconferencing, electronic access to files. So it really wasn't too onerous to just simply set up a home office and work from there all the time. And sort of things were fairly smooth to roll with. So I think it's fair to assume that, you know, we have a bit of a reprieve, at least in Northwestern Ontario right now, for the most part. If you can use this time to take advantage of it and get what you might need in place to make sure that if there's a second wave or a third wave and you have to go back into lockdown, that you're prepared to do so, maybe better than you were this time around. So depending, I think that'll really be dependent on what kind of workplace you have. But if you need, look into what software, IT supports you have, what your employees need to work from home, if that's an option, what other investments you can make now, and take what action you can do now to improve the resiliency of your business. It'll probably pay off. Maybe, I mean, hopefully we don't have to go there, but I think it's probably fair to assume that we will, and that this will be valuable investments that will pay off in the long run. So I think that's the summary of what we have for you, and we have time to take any questions. If you want to post them in the chat bar, I think that's probably the best way to do it. And if you want, we can go back to any sort of specific part of the presentation, or we can just sort of field questions as they come.
Hey, I don't see any questions at the moment, Chair, but I just want to thank you guys, both of you, for coming in today and talking about this. Like, as you had mentioned, like this is changing all the time. So to develop that task force that's going to monitor this, I think that's key for anybody that's reopening, and just to ensure the safety of the staff and our clients and the community as a whole, I guess. And you provided a great information and resources there. And I'm sure, okay, we have a question here. Sorry about that. Marlene asks, what is the definition of an essential worker?
Etienne, how do you want to do these? Should we just go back and forth?
My understanding of the definition of essential worker is when we looked at it in the context of the public health people who require PPE, they were defined under the Act as being essential. Now you have the government issuing their orders, and it's important to have a look at that and see whether or not those orders apply, and whether or not they're listed as people who are essential under those orders. Again, it's important to think that if someone's essential, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be physically present, or it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be working beside somebody. You know, as an employer, you're going to have an obligation to look at how do you make that essential workers return to the workplace safe. So I would, again, consult the legislation and look at the emergency orders to see if essentials, if you're defined as essential worker there. Molly, I think ready for that.
We have another question here. What happens if your organization implements an on-call system additional to changes? So does that mean I guess, is the question more if you're on call but not working all the time, maybe not present in the office, additional changes. If that's something that'll work for your workplace, that's probably a great way to keep your employees at home, if that's what the question is, if that's what your question is more directed to. If you want to just add in the chat bar, hopefully try and answer that more specifically. But the next question, Cheryl Bailey, is there a duty to accommodate an employee who they themselves may not have an issue, but live with someone who does? So there are these new statutory leaves that are created. They are unpaid if you can't come to work for these circumstances because you have to look after someone who may be sick. And this does get a little bit more complicated if it's accommodating someone, you know, who is still working. It's a pretty new, novel area where going to work can just expose you to so much risk. There are protections. You can't discriminate against employees based on a number of reasons, and family status is one. So I think that's sort of something that we'll have to determine on a case-by-case basis. Arguably, if there's a way that you can be accommodated so you can work safely from home or work safely at your workplace and not put yourself at risk, or if you can implement that for your employees so that they can still work safely so they don't expose their family to a dangerous situation. I think that's something that should be explored, but it's a fairly new, these are new circumstances, so it's sort of hard to see how that's going to shake out every single time. I don't know if Etienne, if you want to add more there.
No, I have nothing more to add to that question. The next question is a challenging one concerning hazard pay, and should it be considered for First Nation staff working with COVID positive clients. We would have to know more about the circumstances in which that's being referred to. For example, if it's a nurse who's working in a COVID unit and that's what their job is, I suspect they are likely getting hazard pay. However, all that's contingent on funding agreements and so forth as well. So if your employer is getting funding for it, that should be passed on to the worker. If not, then you need to get the politicians involved to advocate for that. And we saw that here in Thunder Bay, where the local transit operators were trying to get hazard pay because they're dealing with all sorts of people from the public coming and going off the buses, and they got the local politicians. Well, they tried to get the local politicians. I don't think the city ultimately gave them the support that they wanted to get the hazard pay. They never got it either, as far as I understand. But that'd be the route to take for advocating.
Yeah.
Anything more for that, Mom?
No. Yeah, I think it's going to depend more on the circumstances, and we'll have to know more information. Kathy, I see you've added more. So the organization is trying to set up on-calls and weekends now. Should staff be paid more than their work week pay? i.e. CHR is responsible to go into client homes to provide support. So I think that's a circumstance where you need to just know a lot more information about the actual workplace and the actual circumstances. It's hard to give a general answer to that question at the time, and it would have to do more with overall what their work expectations and hours are, if their hours are actually changing, what's in the contract, the circumstances of the specific employer and employee relationship and the job. But I think in general, if there's just accommodations or changes to the work that basically allow you to do it in a more flexible way without adding extra duties to the point where it's fundamentally changing the job description, that's probably going to be fair. But where you're changing the nature of the job significantly, adding new duties, making changes to pay, those are things that generally your employer can't do unilaterally. But again, it's hard to give a more specific answer. You have to really do it on a case-by-case basis and understand the circumstances at the time and the actual job. So I hope that answered your question.
Right, some good questions that came from participants there. Again, thank you for coming out today and providing this information for the attendees. This will be available as a replay, so for anybody that's online right now with us, you can certainly watch it again after. Now, like this is an opportune time for employers and employees to review the legislation and as it applies to return to work in COVID-19. As Etienne and Molly both mentioned, this is a changing environment and new legislation and health and safety policies are coming into, and we need to be mindful of those and keep on track just to keep everybody safe. There is likely a second wave coming from all indication from the health authorities. So just be safe and implement all the policies that you can to keep your workforce and your clients and the general public. Now, Molly and Etienne, do you have any closing remarks before we close here?
I would just like to say thank you for everyone who's listening to us talk to you for the past almost an hour now. It's a very complicated area. We are here to share information, so if you ever have any questions or anything like that, just don't hesitate to send me or Molly an email or give us a call. We're trying to stay on top of everything that's changing. We're trying to stay on top of resources as well. So if you need, if you have a general question about potential resources, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, Molly.
Yeah, thanks for attending. It was fun. I hope it was informative for everyone. Hopefully, yeah. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to give us a call. And yeah, as Etienne said, we post fairly regularly on our Facebook and website different articles, and lately it's mostly just been about COVID. So if there's anything you might want to check out and see if we have an answer there, or at least something interesting to read about it.
At least drop by and visit and like our page.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's how I found out about this, because I saw your article, Molly's post on the Facebook page. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to bring that in as a webinar for our clients here. So, okay, Joyce. Oh, okay, I guess it's more of a statement than a comment or a question. This would be a ripple effect from Southern first wave through. Okay, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and maintain that social distancing, and good health to everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.